Novel title, Winter Harbour Jazz Club, by author J. M. Peters. Chapter 1. Rain arrived sideways across Victoria that November afternoon, blown hard off the harbour in silver bands that made pedestrians lower their heads and walk faster beneath umbrellas already failing at their intended purpose. The city looked blurred around the edges. Ferry horns drifted through the fog from somewhere beyond the inner harbour, low and mournful, like exhausted animals calling to one another in the dark. Freddie O'Keefe stood beneath the awning outside Habit Coffee, watching rainwater race along the curb while stirring cream into an Americano he no longer particularly wanted. Retirement, he had discovered after 14 months, involved an astonishing amount of unnecessary coffee. Not the pleasant kind. Not the occasional cafe stop during meaningful errands. Endless coffee instead. Coffee inserted into empty spaces where work used to exist. Coffee that functioned less as enjoyment and more as punctuation between hours. At 51, Freddie had become a man professionally qualified in the management of free time. He walked every morning, read history books he forgot almost immediately after finishing, organized investment accounts that were already organized, experimented briefly with sourdough bread before realizing he disliked both baking and people who discussed hydration percentages with emotional intensity. He owned a waterproof jacket specifically designed for West Coast retirees who liked discussing ferry schedules. Sometimes he caught sight of himself reflected in storefront windows downtown and experienced the faintly unsettling sensation of resembling his former clients. Men who had once sat across from his desk explaining early retirement plans with forced enthusiasm while quietly radiating confusion. The realization irritated him. Freddie had done everything correctly. He had built O'Keefe Accounting Services from a 2-room leased office above a travel agency into a stable little practice, handling taxes, payroll, and corporate filings for restaurants, contractors, fishing operators, boutique hotels, and small businesses scattered across southern Vancouver Island. He had worked 60-hour weeks through his 40s, paid down debt, avoided reckless purchases, maxed out investment contributions with religious consistency, sold the practice at a respectable valuation to a younger accountant named Daniel Wu, who still believed software integrations were exciting. Freddie had earned this life. So why did every afternoon feel like waiting inside an airport for a delayed flight? He lifted the coffee again. Cold already. A passing bus hissed through rainwater. Tourists hurried beneath umbrellas near Government Street. Somewhere farther down toward the harbor, a street musician played saxophone badly beneath a covered entrance, notes dissolving into wet wind. Freddie checked his watch despite having nowhere to be. Then his phone vibrated. Unknown number. He almost ignored it. Instead, he answered with the cautious neutrality of someone who spent 30 years fielding calls from anxious business owners. Freddie O'Keefe. Static crackled briefly. Then a woman's voice. Mr. O'Keefe, this is Sandra Martinez from Harborside Credit Union. Sorry to bother you. I'm trying to reach you regarding Leon Bouchard. Freddie stared out at the rain. Of course it was Leon. Even in disappearance, Freddie thought later, Leon managed to create paperwork. He closed his eyes briefly. What happened now? A pause. That's partly why I'm calling. 20 minutes later, Freddie stood beneath the faded blue awning of Winter Harbour Jazz Club while rain hammered the sidewalk above him. The entrance sat half below street level, along a narrow side lane off Wharf Street, easy to miss unless you already knew where it was. A small neon saxophone glowed weakly in the front window. Water dripped steadily from rust-darkened gutters overhead. The club looked exactly as it always had. Slightly damp, slightly tired, stubbornly alive. Freddie descended the concrete steps slowly. The smell reached him before the door fully opened. Oak, old carpet, citrus cleaner, wet wool jackets, faint mildew, whisky soaked into wood over decades. Underneath everything floated the ghostly metallic scent of brass instruments and rainwater tracked indoors by musicians arriving after ferry crossings. The room was dark except for amber lamps along the bar. Winter Harbour never seemed fully connected to daytime. Even at 3 in the afternoon it existed in permanent late evening. A woman behind the bar looked up from polishing glasses. Raina, 38 maybe, sharp-eyed, dark hair tied carelessly behind her head, intelligent in a way that made people either trust her immediately or become defensive around her. Freddie had always suspected she understood the club better than Leon did. "You heard." Freddie removed his coat slowly. "He's missing." Raina nodded once. "Haven't seen him in almost 3 weeks. And nobody called me until now? We thought he'd come back." That was optimistic. "That's Leon." "Fair point." Freddie moved farther inside. Winter Harbour Jazz Club seated maybe 60 people legally, 40 comfortably. Small round tables crowded close beneath low-hanging lamps. Framed black and white jazz photographs lined dark walls stained faintly gold from decades of cigarette smoke predating modern regulations. The stage in the corner looked barely large enough for a quartet. Rain pressed softly against narrow street-level windows near the ceiling. The place felt suspended outside ordinary time. Freddie had spent years here without ever truly noticing it. Not socially. Leon had always insisted meetings happen at the club because he hated offices. Freddie would arrive carrying folders while musicians sound-checked in the background, and Leon argued passionately about cash flow problems he clearly intended not to solve. Most clients exhausted Freddie. Leon fascinated him. The man operated entirely on instinct, no budgets, no planning, no meaningful inventory control. Yet somehow, Winter Harbour survived recessions, pandemics, liquor law changes, and Victoria's increasingly impossible commercial rents through methods Freddie never fully understood. Leon treated accounting principles more like weather forecasts than rules. And yet, Freddie had liked him enormously, which made the current situation unexpectedly unsettling. Raina slid a glass across the bar. "Not whiskey. Tea." "You looked cold." Freddie accepted it carefully. "Tell me." She leaned against the shelves behind the bar. "He left after closing one night. Said he was taking the ferry to Vancouver for a couple days." "When?" "About 3 weeks ago." "And?" "And nothing. No calls, no emails, phone disconnected 2 days later." "Police?" "They made a report." Freddie nodded slowly. Leon disappearing voluntarily was entirely plausible. Leon disappearing permanently felt different somehow. "What about family?" Raina hesitated. "His daughter called yesterday." "Isabel? You remember her?" "Barely." Freddie remembered a serious teenage girl sitting silently in booths years earlier while Leon entertained musicians after closing. She used to read thick novels while jazz played around her. Freddie recalled dark hair and an expression suggesting permanent disappointment. "She's flying in from Montreal tomorrow," Raina said. Freddie rubbed rainwater from his glasses. "And the bank called me because—" Raina disappeared briefly into the office behind the bar. When she returned, she carried a thick accordion folder held together with elastic bands. Freddie felt immediate dread. Paperwork was rarely delivered in accordion folders unless catastrophe had matured significantly. Raina placed it carefully on the bar. "Apparently," she said, "you own the club." Freddie blinked. "No, I don't. That's what I said." She opened the folder. Inside sat copies of corporate restructuring documents Freddie vaguely remembered drafting nearly 8 years earlier during one of Leon's many financial emergencies. Freddie adjusted his glasses again. "Oh no!" Raina watched him. "That expression doesn't inspire confidence." "It shouldn't." He flipped pages faster. There it was, buried beneath debt restructuring language involving private loans, supplier obligations, and temporary operational contingencies. Freddie remembered the situation now. Leon had nearly lost the business after a disastrous year involving flooding damage, tax penalties, and a failed kitchen expansion nobody asked for. To satisfy creditors temporarily, Freddie had created a provisional operational transfer structure in case Leon became incapacitated before liabilities were settled. At the time, it had seemed harmless, because normal people did not vanish mysteriously across ferry terminals. Freddie continued reading, then stopped. "Well," he said quietly, "that's unfortunate." Raina folded her arms. How unfortunate. Freddie looked around the room slowly, rain tapping windows, half-lit bottles glowing amber behind the bar, dust drifting through stage lights, an upright piano resting silent in the corner beneath framed Miles Davis photographs. The entire strange, melancholy organism of Winter Harbour Jazz Club. Then, back down at the paperwork. Legally speaking, he exhaled. Very. Chapter 2. Freddie spent the next morning trying not to own a jazz club. He did this with the disciplined energy of a man accustomed to solving problems by refusing their emotional premise. At 7:30, he sat at his dining table in James Bay with 3 folders, 2 legal pads, a laptop, a coffee, and the unfortunate restructuring agreement spread before him like evidence from a crime scene. Outside, rain moved down the windows in long vertical threads. Inside, Freddie read every clause twice. By 9:15, he understood the matter completely, which was irritating because understanding did not improve it. The agreement was valid. Temporary operational control of Winter Harbour Jazz Club had indeed transferred to him the moment Leon Bouchard became unavailable to manage outstanding obligations. Freddie was not the true owner in the grand poetic sense. He had no right to sell the place, rename it, convert it into condominiums, or install a frozen yogurt machine, though the last possibility seemed legally ambiguous. But he was responsible for keeping the business functioning while creditors, family, lawyers, and whatever remained of Leon's life sorted themselves into something resembling order. He called Daniel Wu, the young accountant who had purchased Freddie's practice, and explained the situation. Daniel listened quietly, then said, "So you retired into receivership?" "That is not helpful." "It's accurate." "I was hoping for sympathy." "From an accountant?" Freddie rubbed his forehead. Daniel laughed once, softly. Freddie had not enjoyed mentoring him nearly enough while it was happening. Daniel had been too confident, too energetic, too irritatingly comfortable with software. Yet now Freddie found himself missing the daily presence of another competent person. "You need counsel," Daniel said. "I know. And current financials." "I know. And liquor license review." "I know. And payroll status." "I know that too." A pause. "You sound happy," Daniel said. Freddie looked at the rain. "I am absolutely not happy." "No," Daniel said. "Of course not." By 10:30, Freddie had called a lawyer, the credit union, the liquor licensing office, the landlord's representative, and one supplier who seemed unsurprised that Leon had disappeared, but deeply interested in whether unpaid whisky invoices would now become Freddie's personal burden. "No," Freddie said. The supplier sighed with professional disappointment. By noon, Freddie had built a preliminary spreadsheet titled Winter Harbour Emergency Review. The title alone steadied him. Numbers began appearing in orderly rows: rent, payroll, liquor inventory, supplier payables, loan balance, sales tax arrears, average weekly bar revenue, estimated ticket receipts, repairs outstanding, unknown liabilities. There were many unknown liabilities. Freddie disliked unknown liabilities. They were the financial equivalent of noises in the basement. At 1:15, he put on his raincoat and walked to the club. Winter Harbour looked worse in daylight. Not atmospheric worse. Actual worse. The stairs needed repair. The side entrance had water damage. One window seal had failed, leaving condensation trapped between panes like trapped fog. The brass handle on the front door was loose. A small sign near the entrance advertised a trio that had performed 11 months earlier. Inside, Raina was counting bottles behind the bar, while a young man with a beard and a black knit cap adjusted microphone cables on the stage. "Good," she said when Freddie entered. "You came back." "I had hoped not to." "That's usually how people get involved with this place." The young man glanced over. "This the accountant?" Freddie removed his wet coat. "I prefer Freddie." "Eli?" the young man said. "Sound, bookings, occasional bass, unpaid optimism." Raina smirked. He also fixes the toilet." "Then he is essential," Freddie said. Eli studied him with wary amusement. "Are you closing us?" "I've been operationally responsible for less than 24 hours. I'm trying not to do anything dramatic before I understand the situation." "That sounds like accountant for yes." "It's accountant for I don't know." Raina nodded toward the office. "You should see it." Freddie had been inside Leon's office many times, but always as a visitor, never as the person expected to make sense of it. The room was narrow and windowless, wedged behind the bar like a confession booth for failed business plans. A metal desk sat beneath crooked shelves loaded with binders, old liquor invoices, jazz biographies, trumpet mouthpieces, tax notices, napkins covered in set lists, and at least 12 coffee mugs containing pens that did not work. A framed photograph of Leon hung on the wall near the desk. In the photo, he stood beside the piano with one arm around an elderly black saxophonist whose name Freddie could not remember, but whose face suggested he had forgiven almost nothing and understood everything. Leon grinned broadly. His silver hair fell over his forehead. He looked exhausted, pleased, and slightly doomed. Freddie sat in Leon's chair. It squeaked under him. "That needs replacing," he said. "Leon said it had character," Raina replied from the doorway. Leon confused character with deferred maintenance. That was basically his business model. Freddie opened the desk drawers. Receipts, more receipts, check stubs, a harmonica, reading glasses, a small notebook, ibuprofen, loose coins, a ferry schedule from the previous spring, 3 unpaid parking tickets. The notebook caught his attention. Its cover was black, worn smooth at the edges. Freddie opened it expecting supplier notes or passwords. Instead, he found handwriting. Leon's handwriting had always looked like music trying to escape the page. October 3rd. Arthur played like he was saying goodbye to somebody. Forgot Misty halfway through, found something better. October 7th. Raina says numbers don't lie. I told her numbers lie constantly, just more politely than people. October 11th. Man in booth 6 again, navy coat, drinks Macallan too slowly, keeps looking at door, waiting or hiding. October 19th. Isabel called, did not answer, coward. Freddie paused. Raina watched him carefully. What is it? Leon kept notes. He kept everything. These are personal. Leon didn't believe in categories. Freddie turned another page. October 24th. Freddie would hate this month's books. Maybe Freddie would fix them. Maybe Freddie needs something broken enough to fix. The sentence sat there quietly. Freddie read it twice, then closed the notebook. What? Nothing. Raina raised an eyebrow. You accountants are terrible liars. That is because lying complicates record-keeping. He slipped the notebook back into the drawer, then immediately changed his mind and put it in his coat pocket. Operational review, he said, because phrases like that helped restore gravity. I need full access to sales records, payroll, supplier accounts, current bookings, and liquor inventory. Raina gave him a look. Leon's password system was spiritual. I'm sorry? He changed passwords depending on what record he was listening to. Freddie stared. That is not a system. To Leon it was. What was the last record? Bill Evans, Sunday at the Village Vanguard. Freddie typed several guesses into the office computer. None worked. Eli leaned into the doorway. Try LaFaro, 1961. Freddie did. The computer opened. Nobody spoke for a moment. That is, Freddie said finally, not acceptable cybersecurity. No, Raina said, but very Leon. By 4 o'clock, Freddie had discovered the club was in worse condition than anticipated and better condition than it deserved. Sales were inconsistent, but not hopeless. Whiskey margins were poor because Leon had priced premium pours as though Victoria were still affordable in 1998. Food service lost money every month, though calling it food service seemed generous. Payroll was tight but not outrageous. Rent was punishing. Repairs had been ignored long enough to become philosophical, but attendance, oddly, held. Not huge numbers, not profitable numbers, but steady. The same names appeared in reservations and ticket sales with quiet persistence. Thursday regulars, Sunday late sets, rainy Tuesday piano nights that should have been financial disasters, but somehow filled half the room. People came here, again and again. Freddie printed reports, lined them up, and began making notes. At 5:30, the club opened. Not dramatically. No velvet rope, no line outside, just Raina unlocking the door, Eli testing sound, and a dishwasher arriving late with wet hair and a skateboard tucked under one arm. Then the regulars began descending the stairs. An elderly man in a brown tweed coat who nodded to no one but sat immediately at the same table near the piano. Two women in their 60s who greeted Raina with theatrical complaints about the weather. A tired-looking provincial employee with loosened tie and government ID still clipped to his belt. A widower named Stan who apparently came every Wednesday and ordered 1 beer, 1 whiskey, and 1 bowl of mixed nuts in exactly that sequence. Freddie watched from the end of the bar, pen in hand. "Do they know?" he asked. Raina poured wine. "About Leon? Some. About me? They'll figure it out." At 7, Arthur Bell arrived. He was 70 years old, tall and narrow, dressed in a charcoal suit that had once been elegant and now hung from him like a memory. His hair was white and swept back. His hands were large, beautiful, and slightly tremulous. He moved slowly toward the piano, pausing twice as though uncertain whether he had forgotten something important or merely ordinary. Raina lowered her voice. "Arthur, the pianist. The reason half these people still come." Arthur sat at the piano bench, lifted the fallboard, and placed both hands on the keys without playing. For several seconds he remained perfectly still. Then he began. The first notes were sparse, not showy, not sentimental. They entered the room carefully, as though testing whether anyone inside could bear them. Conversations softened. Glasses settled onto tables. Rain tapped lightly against the high windows. Freddie did not know the tune. He knew enough jazz to recognize sadness when arranged competently. Arthur played like a man walking through rooms in a house where everyone had already moved away. Freddie stood very still. For the first time in months, perhaps longer, he forgot to check the time. Halfway through the set, Arthur stopped. His hands hovered above the keys. The room waited. Raina straightened behind the bar. Arthur looked out toward the tables, blinking. Then he smiled faintly and resumed with a different tune altogether, one Freddie did know. Autumn Leaves. Nobody objected. Maybe jazz, Freddie thought, was partly the art of making confusion sound intentional. After the set, Arthur approached the bar. Raina poured him soda water without being asked. Arthur looked at Freddie. "You're Leon's numbers man." "I suppose I am." "Where is he?" Freddie hesitated. "We don't know." Arthur absorbed this slowly, then nodded as if confirming something he had already suspected. "Leon always wanted exits," he said. "Did he?" Arthur smiled. "All musicians do, even the ones who own chairs." "I didn't know Leon played." "Badly," Arthur said, but with conviction. "Dangerous combination." Freddie found himself smiling. Arthur lifted his glass. "He told me once you were the only accountant who listened like a drummer." "I have no idea what that means." Neither did he. Arthur drifted away toward the stage again. By closing time, Freddie had corrected 3 supplier entries, identified a recurring overcharge in the club's insurance billing, and watched a room full of lonely people pretend not to be lonely while music gave them temporary permission. At 1 in the morning, after the last customer climbed the stairs into rain, Raina locked the door. The club settled into silence. Eli coiled cables on stage. Somewhere in the building, a pipe knocked faintly. Freddie stood behind the bar reviewing the till. Cash deposits did not match recorded sales for 6 of the last 9 weeks. Not dramatically, but consistently. Small differences. Too regular to be accidental, too irregular to be simple theft. Raina noticed his expression. "What?" Freddie tapped the paper. These deposits are wrong. She came closer. How wrong? Not enough to explain anything, enough to bother me. Everything bothers you. Incorrect. Many things merely disappoint me. Raina studied the figures. Leon handled cash deposits. Always? Usually. Freddie circled 3 entries. Did he ever mention why he was taking the ferry? No. Did he seem different before he left? Raina looked toward the empty stage. Yes. Freddie waited, but she did not continue. Outside, a ferry horn sounded through the harbor fog, distant and low. For a moment, the whole club seemed to listen. Raina wiped the bar slowly. He stood right there after closing, she said at last, the night before he left. He said places disappear before people do. Then he laughed like he wished he hadn't said it. Freddie felt the sentence move through him uneasily. In his coat pocket, Leon's small black notebook pressed against his ribs. The club smelled of oak and rain and old music. Freddie looked around at the tables, the stage, the empty glasses waiting to be washed, the dim lamps still glowing softly against the dark. He had meant to stabilize the business. That was all. But already, without quite agreeing to it, he had begun listening for Leon in the silence. Chapter 3. Freddie woke the next morning with the unpleasant sensation that his life had resumed without consulting him. For nearly a year and a half, mornings had arrived gently. Coffee, rain, news headlines about interest rates and ferry disruptions. Maybe a walk along Dallas Road if the weather cooperated. Time moved loosely, without urgency. Now he opened his eyes already thinking about payroll. The realization should have alarmed him more than it did. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling while wind rattled faintly against the condo windows. Somewhere nearby, gulls screamed over the harbor. Victoria mornings possessed a particular grayness in November. Not dramatic storm darkness, but a softer maritime exhaustion, as though the city itself had stayed awake too late listening to rain. Freddie got up, shaved carefully, and dressed with more attention than necessary. At 8:30, he found himself standing in Cook Street Village buying pastries he did not want, because people working long shifts required baked goods. This seemed to him both irrational and entirely correct. By 9:15 he was back at Winter Harbour carrying coffee trays and paper bags through sideways rain. Raina looked up from behind the bar. "You brought croissants." "I'm establishing managerial authority." "With butter?" "Morale matters." Eli emerged from the office rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You're one of those bosses who becomes dangerous after reading business books, aren't you?" "I spent 30 years preventing roofing contractors from claiming jet skis as tax deductions," Freddie said. "I assure you my ambitions are modest." Eli accepted coffee suspiciously. The club looked different in the morning, smaller somehow. Without music and low light, Winter Harbour became an aging basement room with warped floors and visible stains on the ceiling near the back hallway. Daylight filtering weakly through the upper windows exposed accumulated imperfections Leon had apparently spent years strategically dimming. Freddie respected that. There was artistry in selective lighting. He set down the pastries and opened his laptop at the bar. "Today's priorities," he announced. Raina groaned softly. "You made priorities." "Civilization depends on them." Leon believed civilization was overrated. "Yes," Freddie said. "That's why the liquor distributor nearly sued him twice." Eli leaned against the stage. "So, what happens now?" Freddie hesitated. The honest answer was he had no idea. Legally, operational control remained temporary pending investigation into Leon's status and review of various financial obligations. Practically, however, Winter Harbour needed immediate decisions. Payroll, scheduling, repairs, supplier negotiations, inventory control. Businesses did not pause for existential uncertainty. "They stay open," Freddie said finally. Raina looked mildly surprised. "You already decided?" "I decided the alternative requires explaining unemployment to musicians in Victoria during a housing crisis. I prefer avoiding that conversation." Eli raised his coffee cup slightly. "To accidental leadership. Freddie ignored him. Also, he added, this place hemorrhages money in several preventable ways. There he is, Raina said quietly. The accountant emerges. Freddie almost corrected her, then realized she was right. Something inside him had awakened during the past 24 hours. Not joy exactly. Something sharper. A returning sense of orientation. Problems, manageable problems, people needing decisions. He had missed this more than he understood. By late morning, Freddie was buried inside invoices in Leon's office while rain drummed steadily overhead. The office smelled faintly of dust, coffee grounds, and old paper. He had opened 2 filing cabinets and discovered Leon's organizational methods relied heavily on intuition and geographical optimism. Whisky invoices appeared mixed with musician contracts, handwritten set lists, ferry schedules, and notes regarding plumbing issues written on napkins from another restaurant entirely. Yet patterns slowly emerged. Freddie had always believed accounting resembled archaeology more than mathematics. Numbers buried things. Human beings buried them badly. Around noon he found another notebook. This one smaller. Blue cover. Elastic band around the middle. Inside, January 14th. Woman at table 4 cried through entire second set. Pretended she had allergies. Tipped $70. March 2nd. Freddie says inventory variance is unacceptable. Freddie has clearly never met trumpet players. April 9th. If a club survives long enough, people start treating it like church without admitting that's what they're doing. Freddie sat back slowly. The entries disturbed him in ways he could not entirely explain. Not because they were dramatic, because they were observant. Leon had been watching people carefully, noticing loneliness the way other men noticed weather. A knock interrupted him. Raina stood in the doorway. She's here. Who? Leon's daughter. Freddie closed the notebook immediately, which made him feel guilty despite having done nothing technically wrong. Isabelle Bouchard stood near the front entrance removing rain gloves with efficient irritation. She looked younger than Freddie remembered. Mid-40s perhaps. Dark hair cut shorter now. Black wool coat still damp from outside. Intelligent eyes identical to Leon's except less forgiving. She glanced around the club not nostalgically but diagnostically, as though assessing damage after a storm. When she noticed Freddie approaching, she nodded politely. Mr. O'Keefe. Freddie, please. You look exactly the same. That feels statistically unlikely. It's the glasses. Fair enough. Raina disappeared tactfully toward the back. Isabelle surveyed the room again. He's really gone. Not a question. Freddie chose his words carefully. No one's heard from him. That's not unusual. You expected this? She laughed once without humor. I expected some version of this eventually. Freddie gestured toward the bar. Coffee? Whisky, actually. It's noon. I flew overnight from Montreal. Time zones no longer apply. Freddie considered objecting, then poured 2 small Macallans instead. They sat near the far end of the bar beneath a photograph of Chet Baker looking beautifully exhausted. Isabelle lifted the glass, smelled it first. He kept buying bottles he couldn't afford. He considered that cultural investment. He considered everything cultural investment. Rain whispered softly against the windows. For several moments neither spoke. Then Isabelle said, Did he leave you the club? Freddie nearly choked on whiskey. Not intentionally. That sounds like him. He explained the restructuring clause. Halfway through, Isabelle closed her eyes. Oh my God. I agree. He once transferred partial ownership of his car to a trombone player because they had an argument about Miles Davis. Freddie stared. Was the trombone player legally competent? Debatable. Despite himself, Freddie laughed. It startled both of them slightly. Isabelle relaxed a fraction after that. He talked about you, she said. That concerns me. He trusted you. He ignored almost all of my advice. Yes, she said, but he trusted you. Freddie looked down into the amber whiskey. Trust, an uncomfortable word. Accountants usually received dependence, irritation, or carefully concealed panic. Trust was rarer. He loved this place more than anything, Isabel said quietly. There it was. Not accusation exactly, but close enough to cast a shadow. Freddie waited. My mother used to say the club got the best version of him, Isabel continued. Everybody else got whatever energy remained afterward. That sounds difficult. It was. She turned slowly on the stool, studying the room. When I was a kid, I used to sit over there with headphones pretending not to listen while musicians drank until 2 in the morning, talking about records nobody else cared about. I knew more about Charlie Parker at 14 than basic life skills. Freddie smiled faintly. Useful at parties? Devastatingly. A silence settled between them, oddly comfortable. Winter Harbour during daytime possessed the intimacy of a theater before performance. Chairs waiting, lights dimmed but not yet meaningful, possibility suspended in stale air. Finally, Isabel asked, "Do you think he killed himself?" The directness of it hit Freddie physically. No. The answer came too quickly. She noticed. You're sure? No, Freddie admitted. I'm not sure of anything, but Leon didn't feel... He searched carefully. Finished? Isabel stared at the bar top. He was tired. Yes. He drank too much. Yes. He avoided people when things became emotionally complicated. Freddie nodded. That too. She smiled sadly. Then disappearing is actually very on brand. In the afternoon, Freddie gave her a tour of the books. This proved less emotionally devastating than expected, because Isabel already understood her father's relationship with financial structure resembled jazz improvisation more than management. He still categorized whiskey purchases as hospitality development? Until last month. He did that for 20 years. He was consistent. That's one word for it. They worked surprisingly well together. Isabel possessed quick intelligence, sharpened by long familiarity with chaos. She understood immediately which problems mattered and which merely looked frightening inside spreadsheets. She had inherited Leon's instincts without his romanticism. At 4:30 they took a break. The rain had briefly stopped. Outside, harbor fog drifted between buildings while seaplanes crossed low overhead toward Vancouver. Government Street glistened beneath pale afternoon light. Tourists moved slowly beneath umbrellas near souvenir shops and bookstores. Freddie and Isabel stood beneath the club awning holding takeaway coffees. He hated retirement, she said suddenly. Freddie looked over. Leon retired. Briefly. About 6 years ago, didn't he tell you? No. He sold half the club to an investor, tried moving to Parksville. She smiled faintly at the memory. Bought sweaters, started discussing bird watching. That sounds alarming. He lasted 11 weeks. What happened? He said every day felt like Sunday afternoon inside an airport. Freddie went still. The phrase landed too close to something unnamed inside him. Isabel watched him carefully. You know exactly what he meant, don't you? Before Freddie could answer, a voice called from the stairway entrance. Club open yet? An older man in a navy raincoat descended halfway into view, carrying a newspaper beneath one arm. Thin, gray mustache, deeply lined face. Freddie recognized him vaguely from previous nights. 6 o'clock, Stan, Isabel called. Stan nodded, apparently satisfied merely confirming the building still existed. As he turned to leave, Freddie noticed him hesitate. You hear from Leon? The old man asked quietly. No, Freddie said. Stan absorbed this without surprise. Then he nodded once. Tell him booth 3's waiting if he comes back. And just like that, he disappeared into the wet street again. Freddie watched him go. What did that mean? He asked. Isabel shrugged. Probably exactly what it sounded like. Inside, the club lights flickered on one by one as evening approached. Gold against gathering blue darkness. For the first time, Freddie noticed Winter Harbour did not really operate like a business. Businesses sold products. This place maintained continuity. People came here to confirm something inside themselves still existed. A booth waiting, a bartender remembering their drink, a pianist forgetting songs but finding others, rain against windows, jazz moving softly through darkness. Temporary proof that loneliness could be shared without discussion. Freddie stood beneath the awning a long moment longer, listening to distant ferry horns move through harbor fog. Then he followed Isabel back downstairs into the slowly glowing club. Chapter 4. By the second week, Freddie developed the strange sensation of being absorbed by the club in stages, not dramatically. Winter Harbour did not consume people through catastrophe. It happened gradually instead, through small practical dependencies that accumulated until a person realized entire days had begun orbiting around leaking taps, liquor invoices, piano tuning schedules, and whether Thursday's quartet would draw enough customers to justify keeping the kitchen open past 10. Freddie noticed this while standing in the produce aisle of a grocery store staring thoughtfully at limes. 2 weeks earlier, limes had been fruit. Now they were inventory. He bought 32. Rain continued almost every day. Victoria possessed dozens of varieties of rain, Freddie had decided over the years. Tourist rain, harbor mist, wind-driven winter rain arriving sideways beneath umbrellas, thin drifting rain that seemed suspended permanently in the air rather than falling from anywhere identifiable. Tonight's rain was jazz club rain, soft enough to encourage melancholy. By 6:30, Winter Harbour had begun filling steadily. Arthur Bell sat alone at the piano running scales quietly while customers drifted inward from wet streets above. Lamps glowed amber against dark wood. Coats dripped near the entrance. Someone laughed softly near booth 4. Eli adjusted microphones with theatrical irritation while Raina restocked whiskey bottles behind the bar. Freddie stood at the till reviewing receipts. "You know," Raina said, "normal people don't smile at spreadsheets." "I am not smiling. You're practically flirting with accounts payable." Freddie glanced down. Unfortunately, she was correct. The supplier restructuring he'd negotiated that afternoon had gone unexpectedly well. 3 payment plans, reduced penalties, improved whiskey margins on 2 premium labels. Small victories, but satisfying ones. "Systems create stability," he said. "Is that what gets accountants excited?" "You'd be amazed." "I suspect I would not." A customer approached the bar and interrupted them. The man was in his late 60s perhaps, broad-shouldered beneath an expensive overcoat, silver-haired, carefully groomed. The kind of man who still wore cologne to ordinary places because habits established during prosperous decades refused to vanish quietly. "Macallan 18, he said. Raina poured without asking for payment first. "Evening, Victor." Victor nodded toward Freddie. "New management?" "Temporary," Freddie said. Victor studied him. "You're the accountant." Freddie was beginning to resent how quickly people identified this. "Is it obvious? You organize coasters unconsciously." Freddie looked down. The coasters were indeed aligned. Victor smiled faintly. "Leon used to deliberately move them after you left." "That sounds like Leon." Victor carried his drink toward booth 6. Freddie watched him go. "Who is he?" "Retired developer," Raina said quietly. "Built half the waterfront condos nobody local can afford." "He comes here regularly?" 3 nights a week, always alone." "Interesting." "No," Raina said. "Mostly sad." The room filled further. By 8 o'clock, nearly every table held someone. Not loud crowds. Winter Harbour was never loud. Conversations remained intimate here, softened by music and low ceilings. People spoke like churchgoers after funerals. Quietly, carefully, as though protecting something fragile. Freddie moved through the room, collecting observations the way accountants collected discrepancies. A divorced couple in their 60s, sitting together without speaking much, but leaving simultaneously after every set. A provincial fisheries employee grading student papers between songs while drinking red wine. Two younger musicians near the back discussing Vancouver rents with the emotional fatigue of battlefield survivors. A woman alone in booth 2 reading Murakami while occasionally looking up toward the stage as if verifying reality still existed. Winter Harbour gathered solitary people the way harbors gathered damaged boats. Arthur began playing shortly after 8:30. Tonight he sounded stronger. Not technically perfect. Occasionally he drifted sideways through melodies before correcting course. But there was authority in the imperfections. The room bent subtly toward him while he played. Freddie found himself watching customers instead of the pianist. Faces changed during music. Loneliness relaxed slightly around the edges. Shoulders lowered. People stopped performing themselves so aggressively. Arthur transitioned into My Funny Valentine. And Victor, the retired developer in booth 6, closed his eyes briefly like a man recognizing an old injury. Freddie noticed Isabel observing the room too. She had returned 3 days earlier after extending her stay indefinitely. Originally she claimed it was temporary until legal matters clarified. Now she spent afternoons helping organize records, speaking with suppliers, and quietly repairing things Leon had ignored for years. Tonight she stood near the back hallway carrying inventory sheets. You seeing it yet? She asked. Seeing what? This place isn't really about jazz. Freddie glanced around. No, he admitted. I don't think it is. Isabel nodded. My father understood something before most people did. Which was that cities are becoming professionally lonely. Freddie considered this. Outside the high windows, rain blurred passing headlights into watercolor streaks. Victoria had changed enormously during the past 15 years. Wealthier, more expensive, more polished. Condominium towers rising beside old brick buildings. Tech workers arriving from Vancouver. Retirees selling Toronto homes for impossible money. Restaurants replacing hardware stores. Boutique hotels replacing diners. The city looked prosperous. It also felt increasingly transient. People drifted through now. Few seemed rooted. He used to say everybody needed a third place, Isabel continued. Home, work, and somewhere else where nobody expected anything from you. That's not financially sustainable. No, she said. But emotionally maybe. Freddie laughed quietly. You sound like him. Unfortunately. At 9:15 the front door opened and a gust of cold, wet air swept downstairs. A man entered carrying a tenor saxophone case, mid-40s, tall, dark coat soaked through from rain, face narrow and exhausted in an oddly elegant way. He looked like someone who had once been handsome carelessly and now wore tiredness with the same accidental charm. Arthur glanced up from the piano immediately. Danny. The saxophonist nodded once. Arthur. Something unspoken moved between them. Raina leaned toward Freddie. Danny Vale. The musician? You've heard of him? Freddie shook his head. Used to be bigger, she said quietly. Toronto, New York for a while, albums, festivals, then alcoholism, divorce, panic attacks, Vancouver Island exile. That's specific. Jazz people gossip worse than accountants. Danny opened the saxophone case slowly while Arthur continued playing. The room noticed him gradually. Conversation softened. Even Victor looked up from booth 6. Is he performing? Freddie whispered. Probably not. Danny assembled the instrument carefully. Arthur transitioned into blues without warning. Then, halfway through the next chorus, Danny began playing from beside the stage. No announcement, no introduction, just sound entering the room like another weather system. Freddie felt it physically. The saxophone tone was rougher than expected, human, scarred, beautiful in places and nearly collapsing in others. Danny played like someone arguing with himself privately in public. Arthur followed effortlessly. The room became very still. Even glasses seemed quieter against tables. Freddie glanced around and saw something he had never witnessed in restaurants, offices, investment seminars, or any of the professionally organized adult environments that had dominated most of his life. Complete attention, not entertainment. Need. The music carried loneliness openly instead of disguising it. People listened the way exhausted travelers listen to distant radio stations late at night while driving unfamiliar highways. Danny finished the tune and lowered the saxophone slightly. Arthur smiled without looking up from the piano. "You're late," he muttered. Danny shrugged. "Fairy." Laughter moved softly through the room. Then they played another tune. Later, near closing, Danny sat alone at the bar nursing whiskey while rain hammered harder outside. Freddie approached carefully. "You're very good," he said. Danny looked mildly alarmed. "Jesus, you sound like my dentist." Freddie blinked. "That was intended sincerely." "Sorry." Danny rubbed tired eyes. "Compliments make me suspicious." "Occupational hazard?" "Existential hazard." Raina placed another whiskey in front of him. "On the house." "You can't afford that." "Neither can you." Danny smiled faintly. Freddie studied him. Up close, the man looked profoundly exhausted. Not drunk, not unstable. Worn down instead, like luggage surviving too many airports. "You knew Leon well?" Freddie asked. Danny stared into the whiskey. "Everybody knew Leon differently." "That sounds evasive." "That's because it is." Freddie waited. Finally, Danny sighed. He gave people places to fail safely. "What does that mean?" Danny gestured vaguely toward the room. "You ever notice how nobody impressive comes here anymore?" Freddie looked around. A government employee asleep over red wine. Stan quietly eating mixed nuts alone. Victor staring into expensive whiskey like a man auditing his own disappointments. Arthur forgetting melodies and finding others. "No," Freddie admitted. "Not especially." "Exactly," Danny said. "The city's full of polished places now. Cocktail bars with Edison bulbs and handcrafted ice cubes. Everybody networking. Everybody branding themselves. Winter Harbour never adapted." "That's usually considered poor business strategy." Danny laughed softly. "Yeah. But people can breathe here." The sentence lingered. Freddie looked around again. The club glowed softly beneath amber lights while rainwater trembled against high windows. Music stands leaned empty beside the stage. Raina counted bottles methodically behind the bar. Isabel reviewed invoices at a corner table with her father's reading glasses perched absent-mindedly atop her head. "Breathe here." An odd phrase, yet accurate. Danny finished the whiskey. Leon understood washed-up people. "You think everyone here is washed up?" "No." Danny stood carefully. "I think everyone here's tired of auditioning for their own life." After he left, Freddie remained at the bar long after closing. The club settled around him slowly. Pipes ticking behind walls, dishwasher humming faintly in the kitchen, rain softening overhead. Raina approached, carrying the night deposit bag. "You okay?" Freddie nodded automatically, then reconsidered. "I'm not entirely sure." "That's progress." "How?" "You sounded dead certain about everything when you first walked in here." Freddie looked down at the bar. "When I retired," he said slowly, "people congratulated me constantly, like I'd reached some finish line everyone agreed existed." He laughed quietly. "Then suddenly nobody needed anything from me anymore. Not really." Raina listened without interrupting. "I kept waiting to enjoy it properly," Freddie continued. "The freedom, the relaxation, all the things financially responsible people are supposed to want." "And?" Freddie looked toward the empty stage. "And it felt like slowly disappearing." Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable silence. Winter Harbour specialized in silences that left room for people inside them. Finally, Raina nodded once. "Yeah," she said softly. "That's why half the people come here." She handed him the deposit bag. Their fingers brushed briefly. "Take it to the safe, boss." Freddie sighed. "I really wish people would stop calling me that." But he took the deposit bag anyway. Chapter 5. The rain finally stopped on a Tuesday. Victoria reacted to clear weather the way other cities reacted to natural disasters. People emerged suddenly. Patios filled. Tourists multiplied. Office workers wandered outdoors carrying coffee with visible gratitude. Sunlight struck the harbor hard enough to make the water look metallic. Seaplanes lifted into blue sky while ferries moved slowly through the strait like floating apartment buildings. Freddie distrusted the entire atmosphere immediately. Good weather in November felt structurally unsound. Still, he walked downtown that morning without a raincoat for the first time in weeks and noticed something unsettling. He was looking forward to work. The realization arrived near Bastion Square while passing a busker playing upright bass beneath weak autumn sunlight. Freddie slowed unconsciously, listening. Not because the musician was exceptional, because he now automatically evaluated whether someone like that might perform well at Winter Harbour on slow Thursdays. He had begun thinking in bookings. This disturbed him profoundly. By 11, he was inside the club reviewing kitchen costs with a level of concentration previously reserved for corporate audits. Winter Harbour's kitchen occupied a narrow room behind the bar, barely large enough for two people to stand without apologizing constantly. The menu consisted mostly of survival food for people drinking late into the evening. Flatbreads, soup, small plates assembled with varying degrees of optimism depending on staffing levels and Leon's emotional state. Freddie stood beside the prep counter holding invoices. "You lose money on almost everything." The cook, a heavily tattooed woman named Marta in her late 50s, continued chopping onions without visible concern. "People get hungry. That's not a business model. Neither is jazz." Fair point. Marta had worked at Winter Harbour 11 years and spoke with the calm authority of someone no longer frightened by management. Her gray hair was tied beneath a bandana. She wore old concert shirts beneath kitchen aprons and smelled faintly of garlic and cigarette smoke, despite apparently never smoking indoors. "She scares suppliers," Raina had explained earlier. "That's one reason we survived." Freddie reviewed another page. "You charge $12 for a cheese plate containing approximately $4 of imported products." People drinking whiskey enjoy pretending they're sophisticated. "Yes," Freddie admitted, "but not profitably enough." Marta looked up finally. "You gonna turn this place into one of those modern cocktail bars?" "No." "Good. I'm simply trying to reduce catastrophic inefficiency." "That sounds worse somehow." Freddie sighed. Everyone at Winter Harbour treated fiscal responsibility like an invasive species. At noon, Isabel arrived carrying folders from the lawyer's office and 2 coffees. "You look tired," she said. "I spent an hour reviewing olive inventory." "And? We may be overinvested in olives." She handed him coffee. "You're adapting frighteningly fast." "I reject that characterization." "You reorganized the liquor storage alphabetically." "That was necessary." "You color-coded supplier invoices." "That was therapeutic." Isabel laughed softly. The sound surprised Freddie. She had spent most of the past week operating with focused restraint, as though emotions remained packed carefully inside luggage she did not intend to unpack while visiting. But she was changing too. Winter Harbour altered people through prolonged exposure. Freddie was beginning to suspect the building itself possessed emotional gravity. They moved upstairs afterward to review legal documents in the empty club. Afternoon sunlight filtered weakly through the high windows, illuminating dust drifting above tables. Without rain and darkness, Winter Harbour looked older than usual. Scratches on wood floors, frayed booth upholstery, tiny cracks in ceiling plaster. The place resembled an aging musician refusing cosmetic surgery out of principle. Isabel spread papers across the bar. "The police still think voluntary disappearance." "Do you?" She hesitated. "I honestly don't know." Freddie nodded slowly. Neither did he. The mystery surrounding Leon remained oddly resistant to panic. There was no violence, no dramatic debt crisis, no evidence of self-harm, just absence. Yet absence accumulated weight over time, especially in places built around routine. Regular customers still asked about Leon nightly now, some casually. Others with quiet concern they attempted disguising as conversation. Freddie had begun noticing how often people glanced toward the office expecting Leon to emerge carrying whiskey bottles and impossible stories. A person could become structural inside a place. Freddie understood that better lately. "What was he like before all this?" he asked. Isabel leaned back against the bar. "You mean before disappearing? Before becoming Leon?" She smiled faintly. "That's difficult. He was always becoming Leon." Outside, sunlight flashed briefly across harbor water. "He played trumpet when he was younger," she said. "Not professionally, but seriously enough to ruin relationships over it. I can imagine. My mother used to say jazz was the third person in their marriage." Isabel stared toward the empty stage. The club came later, after Montreal. After 1,000 different jobs he hated. "What kind of jobs?" "Bookstores, radio station, record distributor. Briefly sold life insurance, which remains one of the funniest things I've ever witnessed." Freddie laughed. "I would have paid money to observe that." He got fired because he kept telling clients mortality was emotionally interesting. "That does seem commercially unhelpful." Isabel nodded. "He opened Winter Harbour when I was 14. Tiny place back then, mostly local musicians and alcoholics." She smiled sadly. "Sometimes, both simultaneously." "And your mother?" "She left 3 years later." The sentence settled quietly between them. Freddie did not press further. Years as an accountant had taught him something useful. People usually revealed important truths sideways first. Direct pressure rarely improved matters. Instead, he asked, "Why did you stay away so long?" Isabel looked surprised. "Excuse me? You live in Montreal. You barely visited. That's usually not geographical." She studied him carefully. "You really were his accountant." "I'm sorry?" "You ask questions like someone reviewing hidden liabilities." Freddie considered denying this, then realized it was accurate. "I suppose I do." Isabel walked slowly toward the stage before answering. "When my mother left, Leon turned the club into his entire personality." Her voice remained calm but thinner now. "Everything became Winter Harbour. Every conversation, every emotional crisis, every friendship." She glanced back at him. "There's a specific loneliness that comes from competing with a place." Freddie absorbed this quietly. The afternoon light softened further across the room. "I loved him," Isabel continued, "but eventually I got tired of orbiting something that consumed everybody near it." Freddie looked around the empty club. The worn tables, the piano, the softly glowing whiskey shelves behind the bar. He understood exactly what she meant. Around 4, Arthur Bell arrived carrying sheet music and looking faintly confused by sunlight. "You people open the curtains," he said accusingly. "We're experimenting with daytime," Freddie replied. Arthur frowned thoughtfully. "Dangerous." He moved toward the piano slowly, setting papers down beside the bench. Today his hands trembled more noticeably. Freddie watched with concern. Arthur noticed immediately. "Don't look at me like a concerned pharmacist." "I was not." "You absolutely were." Arthur sat carefully. The old pianist possessed an extraordinary ability to appear both fragile and deeply stubborn simultaneously. Freddie had learned during recent nights that Arthur forgot names increasingly often, occasionally lost his place during tunes, and once wandered briefly into the kitchen looking for a coat he was already wearing. Yet the moment his hands touched piano keys, coherence returned. Not perfectly, but enough. "Leon used to say memory's overrated in jazz," Arthur muttered while arranging pages. "Claims forgetting forces honesty." "Did you agree?" "No. Leon said many ridiculous things." Arthur began playing softly. Not performance playing. Thinking playing. Loose fragments drifting through the empty afternoon room while sunlight faded gradually toward evening. Freddie sat at the bar, listening. After several minutes, Arthur spoke again without stopping. "You know why clubs fail?" Freddie smiled faintly. I assume you have a theory. Everybody has theories. Mine happens to be correct. Go on. Arthur nodded toward the room. People stopped lingering. Freddie waited. Arthur continued quietly. Cities used to have lingering spaces. Diners, bars, bookstores. Places where nobody hurried you for existing. He played a wandering chord progression. Now everything wants turnover. Freddie thought about Victoria's new waterfront developments. Expensive restaurants where reservations were timed almost mathematically. Coffee shops optimized for laptop workers. Condominiums replacing old storefronts. Efficient spaces. Temporary spaces. Arthur looked up. Winter Harbour survives because nobody here's trying to optimize themselves. The phrase struck Freddie oddly hard. Optimize themselves. That was exactly how retirement literature sounded. Maximize wellness, improve productivity, structured leisure, active aging, as though human beings were retirement portfolios requiring careful balancing. Freddie suddenly felt exhausted by the entire concept. The front door opened upstairs. Voices drifted down. Evening staff arriving. The day folding itself naturally toward night again. Arthur transitioned into blue and green. Outside the high windows, the last sunlight faded over the harbor. The club slowly returned to itself. That evening, business came heavily and unexpectedly. Clear weather apparently encouraged loneliness just as effectively as rain. By 7:30, every table was occupied. Government workers loosened ties beside retired professors. Tourists wandered downstairs accidentally and stayed longer than intended. A middle-aged couple argued quietly through 2 glasses of Pinot Noir before reconciling during Arthur's second set. Freddie moved constantly, restocking bottles, fixing a debit machine problem, negotiating with a supplier by phone near the kitchen, helping Eli carry extra chairs from storage. At one point, he caught his reflection briefly behind the bar. He looked alive, tired, certainly, but alive in a way he had not appeared for months. The realization unsettled him enough that he nearly dropped a tray of glasses. Near 10, Danny Vale arrived again carrying the tenor saxophone. Tonight he looked worse. Dark circles beneath his eyes. Coat wrinkled, hands slightly unsteady while assembling the instrument. Raina noticed too. You okay? She asked quietly. Danny shrugged. Did a corporate fundraiser in Nanaimo. I said, are you okay? He laughed weakly. Ah, emotionally. He considered. Probably not professionally sustainable. Arthur glanced toward him from the piano bench. Then you're qualified for jazz. Danny joined midway through the set. Again the room changed immediately, not louder, deeper somehow. Freddie stood near booth 6 watching customers disappear into the music. Victor sat motionless with whiskey untouched. Stan closed his eyes entirely. A young woman near the back cried silently without embarrassment while pretending to study the drink menu. Nobody looked away. Winter Harbour allowed certain forms of sadness without demanding explanation. During a break, Danny approached Freddie at the bar. You balancing the books yet? Trying. Danny nodded toward the room. Good luck balancing this. Freddie followed his gaze. Arthur laughing softly at something Isabel said near the piano. Raina moving efficiently through crowded tables. Customers lingering long after drinks emptied simply because leaving felt emotionally premature. No, Freddie admitted. I'm beginning to suspect this place runs on something other than money. Danny smiled tiredly. That's the problem. He took a slow sip of whiskey, then added quietly, Leon knew that too. Before Freddie could respond, Danny reached inside his coat pocket and removed a folded ferry receipt. I found this in my sax case last week. Freddie frowned. Why would Leon's receipt be in your sax case? Danny stared into the glass. That, he said softly, is an excellent question. Chapter 6. The ferry receipt sat on Freddie's kitchen table the next morning beside cold coffee and 3 sharpened pencils. Freddie had no memory of sharpening the pencils. This disturbed him more than the receipt. He stared at the small slip of thermal paper while dawn slowly brightened over James Bay outside his condo windows. November light arrived reluctantly, gray-blue and thin. A container ship drifted faintly across the strait beyond the harbor like something half erased. The receipt was dated 19 days earlier. Victoria to Vancouver. 1 passenger. Paid cash. The crossing time matched the night Leon disappeared. Written on the back in Leon's slanted handwriting were 4 words. Don't let it calcify. That was all. No explanation, no signature, no context. Freddie rubbed his eyes. The phrase sounded simultaneously profound and extremely annoying, which meant it was almost certainly Leon. He had spent 27 years helping clients separate meaningful financial irregularities from dramatic nonsense. Most mysteries eventually collapsed into ordinary explanations. Hidden debt, affairs, tax avoidance, untreated depression, alcoholism disguised as entrepreneurship. Yet Leon's disappearance resisted ordinary categories. Nothing added up emotionally. A man preparing suicide usually did not negotiate improved wine pricing 2 days earlier. A man planning permanent escape generally did not leave unfinished notes about ceiling repairs and upcoming trumpet bookings. And Leon had absolutely not been the type to orchestrate elaborate vanishing acts for theatrical effect. He lacked the discipline. Freddie looked again at the handwritten phrase, "Don't let it calcify." Outside, rain began returning softly against the windows. Of course it did. By 10:30, he was back at Winter Harbour carrying the receipt in his coat pocket like contraband. The club smelled of fresh coffee and damp wood. Marta argued with a produce supplier near the kitchen while Eli repaired stage lighting using language creative enough to qualify as experimental poetry. Raina noticed Freddie immediately. "You look like someone who found religion or fraud." "Possibly both." He showed her the receipt. She read the message twice. "That's very Leon." "That sentence explains absolutely nothing." "It explains him." Freddie leaned against the bar. "Why would he leave this in Danny's saxophone case?" Raina shrugged. "Leon left notes everywhere. Books, record sleeves, liquor invoices. Once he hid a customer's divorce papers inside a Mingus album because he said the emotional tone matched. That cannot be legally appropriate." "No," she agreed, "but memorable." Freddie folded the receipt carefully. "Did Leon and Danny know each other well?" Raina hesitated. "Well enough." "That sounds incomplete." "It is incomplete." Freddie waited. Raina polished a glass slowly before continuing. "Danny disappeared for a while 3 years ago." "Meaning?" "Meaning drank himself nearly to death in a motel outside Nanaimo." Freddie winced slightly. "He came back eventually. Clean for a bit. Then not clean. Then clean again." She glanced toward the stage. "Leon kept giving him gigs when nobody else would." "Why?" "Because Leon liked broken musicians." "That is not a sustainable staffing philosophy." "No," Raina said softly, "but compassionate sometimes." The front door opened upstairs. Cold rain air drifted down. Danny himself descended carrying the saxophone case and looking deeply unimpressed by morning existence. "You people discussing my decline again?" "Only professionally," Raina replied. Danny noticed Freddie holding the receipt. "Oh good, the investigation." Freddie gestured toward the bar. "We should talk." "That sentence never improves afternoons." Still, Danny sat. Raina poured coffee instead of whiskey without asking. Danny stared at it suspiciously. "This feels judgmental." "It's 11 in the morning." "Time is a colonial construct." "Alcoholism is not." Danny sighed theatrically but drank the coffee anyway. Freddie placed the receipt between them. "When did Leon give you this?" Danny studied it. "No idea." "That's concerning." Danny shrugged. "Leon used to stuff notes into instrument cases all the time, mostly terrible philosophy." "What was your relationship with him?" Danny leaned back slowly. There it was again, that exhaustion Freddie increasingly associated with musicians over 40. Not physical fatigue exactly, something more existential. The look of people who had spent decades converting emotion into performance until the distinction between sincerity and habit became difficult to locate. "He saved my life once," Danny said finally. The room quieted slightly around the sentence. Even Marta stopped yelling at the supplier. Freddie waited carefully. Danny rubbed both hands around the coffee cup. 3 years ago, I couldn't play anymore. Panic attacks, booze, hands shaking during sets. He laughed once without humor. Turns out audiences become uneasy when saxophonists appear medically haunted. What happened? I disappeared. Freddie noticed the word. Disappeared. Danny continued staring into the coffee. I rented a motel room near Departure Bay and spent about 2 weeks drinking discount vodka while pretending not to understand basic reality. He shrugged faintly. Leon drove up eventually. How did he find you? Danny smiled tiredly. He said musicians always hide near ferries. Rain tapped harder against the windows. What did he do? Freddie asked quietly. Nothing dramatic. Danny looked toward the stage. That was the strange part. He just sat there with terrible motel coffee talking about jazz records for 6 hours until I finally showered. Freddie absorbed this slowly. No intervention speeches, no redemption monologue. Just companionship. Very Leon. He brought me back here afterward, Danny said. Gave me Tuesday nights nobody attended for months until I could play in front of humans again. Raina nodded slightly behind the bar. This place does that. Freddie looked around the empty afternoon club. Dark wood, amber lamps still dimmed low despite daylight, piano waiting silently in the corner. A strange shelter for people drifting near emotional shorelines. He understood it more each day and trusted it less because of that. Businesses should not feel spiritually persuasive. Around 1, Isabel arrived carrying dry cleaning bags and legal updates. She stopped upon seeing Danny. Well, she said, one of my father's favorite catastrophes. Danny placed a hand over his chest. That's genuinely touching. You disappeared from his birthday dinner once. You say that like it narrows the field. Isabel smiled despite herself. The warmth between them surprised Freddie. You know each other well? Danny groaned softly. She used to catch me stealing cigarettes behind the club when she was 15. You were 30. 27. Practically embalmed. Raina laughed outright. Danny looked wounded. This establishment lacks respect for artists. This establishment kept you alive, Isabel said quietly. The joke dissolved gently after that. Danny lowered his eyes. Yeah, he admitted. It did. By late afternoon, the rain intensified again, turning Wharf Street into reflective black glass beneath streetlights. Freddie spent several hours upstairs reviewing older financial records, searching for anything unusual surrounding Leon's final weeks. Patterns slowly emerged. Small cash withdrawals, unusual ferry crossings, several supplier payments made early for reasons unclear, and recurring handwritten notations beside certain nights in Leon's appointment calendar. Full room tonight. Good. Stan looked better. Victor stayed through second set. Woman in green coat finally smiled. None of it resembled business records. It resembled field notes from someone studying loneliness professionally. Freddie sat back in Leon's office, rubbing his forehead. A thought had begun forming recently, one he resisted because it sounded sentimental and therefore suspicious. Leon may have understood the club better than anyone, not financially, humanly. A knock interrupted him. Arthur Bell stood in the doorway, wearing a damp charcoal coat and carrying sheet music beneath one arm. You're in my friend's chair. Freddie immediately stood. Sorry. Arthur waved dismissively. He hated that chair anyway. The old pianist entered slowly, glancing around the office. Smells the same. Dust and unpaid invoices? Regret mostly. Arthur sat carefully opposite Freddie. For several moments he simply looked around the room. You miss him, Freddie said. Arthur nodded once. People think musicians fear dying. He smiled faintly. Mostly we fear becoming irrelevant before it happens. Rain rattled softly overhead. Was Leon irrelevant? Freddie asked. Arthur looked genuinely startled. Good God, no! The answer came instantly. Then Arthur's expression softened. But he was tired. There it was again. Everyone used the same word. Tired. Not suicidal, not unstable, exhausted. Freddie leaned forward slightly. Tired of what? Arthur considered this carefully. Carrying atmosphere. I don't understand. Yes, you do. Arthur gestured vaguely toward the club outside the office. Places like this require emotional labor nobody talks about. Listening to people, remembering them, creating continuity. His hands moved slowly while speaking, pianist's hands even in conversation. Leon spent decades making lonely people feel expected. Freddie thought about Stan asking if booth 3 was still waiting, Victor sitting silently through entire sets, Danny returning from collapse, customers lingering because the room recognized them. That becomes heavy eventually, Arthur said quietly. The old pianist looked suddenly ancient beneath the office light. Not weak, just worn thin by time. Freddie noticed the slight tremor returning to Arthur's fingers. You okay? Arthur smiled. Depends whether we're discussing medicine or existence. Before Freddie could answer, Arthur pointed toward a shelf near the desk. Top left binder. Freddie retrieved it. Inside were old photographs. Winter Harbour through the years. Younger musicians. Crowded tables. Leon laughing beside bartenders long gone. Arthur at the piano decades younger. Black hair falling across his forehead while audiences leaned forward listening. Then one photograph stopped Freddie entirely. Leon and Freddie together behind the bar, maybe 12 years earlier. Freddie wore a suit and looked deeply uncomfortable holding whiskey. Leon grinned beside him triumphantly. Written on the back in Leon's handwriting. Freddie finally stayed past closing. Progress. Freddie stared at the image. He had forgotten that night completely. Yet suddenly, fragments returned. A tax deadline finished late, Leon insisting on one drink afterward, Arthur playing alone while rain hammered the windows. Freddie unexpectedly remaining until nearly 2 a.m. discussing Miles Davis despite knowing almost nothing about jazz. You looked happier then, Arthur said gently. Freddie blinked. I was 40. No, Arthur replied. That's not what I meant. The words lingered after Arthur left for sound check. Freddie remained alone in the office holding the photograph while rain blurred the high windows outside. Happier then, perhaps, or simply less organized emotionally. Retirement had not merely removed work from Freddie's life. It had removed witness. No employees calling, no clients depending on him, no problems requiring interpretation. Days passed cleanly but invisibly. Winter Harbour, by contrast, demanded presence. Messy, exhausting presence. Downstairs, music began softly as Arthur tested the piano. Customers would arrive soon, rain-soaked coats, lonely conversations, whiskey glowing amber beneath low light. Freddie slipped the photograph carefully into his jacket pocket beside the ferry receipt. Then he turned off Leon's office light and went downstairs to open the club. Chapter 7. The first real storm of winter arrived 3 nights later, not ordinary Victoria rain. Pacific storm rain. Wind hammered the harbor hard enough to rattle windows along Wharf Street, while whitecaps churned black beneath the ferry terminal lights. Umbrellas turned inside out. Tree branches bent sideways. Seaplanes were grounded by late afternoon, and news anchors on local television adopted the faintly excited tone Canadians reserved for weather serious enough to inconvenience ferry schedules. By 6 o'clock, Winter Harbour should have been empty. Instead, the club filled early. Storms drove people underground. Freddie noticed this almost immediately. Customers descended the narrow staircase carrying soaked coats and flushed faces, grateful simply to have arrived somewhere warm and dimly lit, where weather became background instead of threat. The club glowed softly against the storm outside. Lamps reflected amber across whiskey bottles. Steam rose faintly from bowls of soup Marta served with aggressive maternal efficiency. The room felt less like a business tonight than a bunker for emotionally displaced civilians. Freddie stood behind the bar reviewing reservations. "We're over capacity." Raina glanced toward the packed tables. "Storm crowds." "That's a thing?" "Oh yeah." She poured Pinot Noir for a middle-aged woman reading alone near the stage. "People don't like being lonely during weather." Freddie considered this. It sounded ridiculous. It also sounded completely true. Arthur arrived wrapped in a long, dark raincoat dripping seawater onto the floor. "Good evening, degenerates," he announced. Several regulars applauded softly. Arthur bowed with mock dignity. "You see," he muttered to Freddie while removing gloves. "Still employable." The old pianist looked tired tonight. More tired than usual. His face appeared thinner somehow beneath the club lights, skin pale against white hair. Freddie noticed him pause briefly beside the piano as though recalibrating privately before sitting. "You all right?" Freddie asked quietly. Arthur waved him off. "Storm pressure." Then, after a beat, "Also mortality." Before Freddie could respond, the front door upstairs slammed violently open. Wind roared briefly down the stairwell. A man descended carrying a saxophone case and cursing weather systems with philosophical intensity. Danny Vale. Completely soaked. "You made it," Raina said. Danny stared at the stormcoat dripping from his shoulders. "I nearly died crossing Government Street." "You live 4 blocks away." The wind attempted murder. Arthur glanced up from the piano. "Good. You're here." Danny stopped. Something in Arthur's tone shifted the room subtly. Not dramatic, just enough. "You okay?" Danny asked. Arthur shrugged. "Hands feel strange tonight." Freddie saw Danny's expression change immediately. Concern. Real concern. Not the casual sympathy people offered aging musicians. Something deeper. Danny set down the saxophone case carefully. "We can cancel." Arthur looked offended. "For weather?" "For health." Arthur snorted softly. "I survived heroin-era jazz clubs in Montreal. I'm not surrendering to arthritis and maritime climate." But Freddie noticed Danny remained uneasy. The first set began at 7:30. Outside, storm winds screamed intermittently against the high windows while rain lashed the harbor in silver waves beneath streetlights. Inside, Winter Harbour contracted inward around music and warmth. Arthur played beautifully, almost frighteningly so. Not energetic, not flashy. Concentrated instead. Every note deliberate, intimate, weighted with strange urgency. The room quieted almost immediately beneath his hands. Danny joined during the second tune. Together they sounded less like performers than old men speaking honestly in a language younger people no longer fully understood. Freddie moved through the crowded room, refilling glasses and watching faces. Victor sat at booth 6 again, staring into whiskey while the storm reflected faintly across the window beside him. Stan occupied booth 3 precisely as always, though tonight he wore a thick fisherman's sweater beneath his coat and looked oddly emotional during slower tunes. Near the back, 2 women in their 30s leaned close over cocktails, discussing divorce with exhausted intensity. At the bar, a provincial government manager Freddie vaguely recognized from previous weeks sat alone reading emails during upbeat songs and staring silently into space during ballads. Winter Harbour absorbed these people without demanding performance. Freddie understood now why they kept returning. The club permitted emotional untidiness. Around 9, during Arthur's solo rendition of Round Midnight, the power flickered. The room inhaled collectively, lights dimmed, music continued. Then the power failed completely. Darkness. A few customers laughed nervously. Outside, the storm roared against the harbor. For several seconds, only Arthur's piano remained audible, the old upright continuing softly through blackness, while emergency lights glowed faint red near the exits. Nobody moved. Freddie felt the room listening, not merely to music, to continuity. Arthur kept playing, one careful note after another. Then Danny's saxophone entered beside him, unseen in the dark. The sound transformed the room. Without lights, without visible performers, the music became strangely disembodied. Rain hammered above. Glasses clinked softly. Someone near the back began crying quietly without embarrassment. Freddie stood motionless behind the bar. The darkness removed social obligations. Nobody needed to look composed anymore. A flashlight beam appeared near the kitchen as Marta swore creatively about electrical systems. Raina lit candles behind the bar one by one. Golden light slowly returned across tables and faces. The club emerged from darkness transformed. Softer now, more intimate. Storm light moved faintly through the high windows while candle flames reflected across whiskey glasses and wet coats. Arthur finished the tune. Silence held for several seconds afterward. Then applause rose slowly, warmly. Not loud but deeply sincere. Arthur bowed his head slightly from the piano bench. Danny looked at him carefully. "You sure you're okay?" Arthur smiled. "Best audience reaction I've had in years. Maybe electrocution's the future of jazz." Laughter moved through the room, but Freddie noticed Arthur's right hand trembling badly now. After the set ended, Freddie followed Arthur toward the back hallway. "Sit down for a minute." "I am sitting down. Pianists are famously seated creatures." "You know what I mean?" Arthur sighed theatrically but allowed Freddie to guide him into the office. The old pianist lowered himself carefully into Leon's terrible chair. "Traitor!" he muttered, patting the armrest. "Still uncomfortable." Freddie handed him water. Arthur accepted reluctantly. "You becoming my doctor now?" "I'm becoming concerned." "Dangerous hobby at your age?" The storm rattled the building overhead. Downstairs, muffled conversations and glasses continued beneath candlelight. Arthur stared toward the closed office door for a long moment, then quietly said, "I forgot my wife's birthday last month." Freddie blinked. Arthur rarely mentioned personal matters. "I'm sorry. She died 11 years ago." The sentence landed softly but heavily. Arthur rubbed his hands together. "I still buy flowers every February. Habit survived memory." He laughed faintly. Then suddenly last month I couldn't remember the date at all. Freddie sat opposite him quietly. Arthur looked older in the office light, not simply elderly, diminishing somehow. "My neurologist says early cognitive decline because apparently musicians aren't allowed dignified exits anymore." "You're still playing beautifully." "Yes." Arthur smiled sadly. "That's the cruel part." Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the harbor. Arthur looked toward the ceiling. Leon knew. Knew what? That I was getting worse. Freddie nodded slowly. "Did he say anything?" "No." Leon understood silence professionally. Arthur's eyes drifted toward the office shelves where old photographs sat beneath dust. "He started booking me more often these past months." Arthur swallowed carefully. "I think he wanted me to keep playing while I still recognized the songs." Neither spoke for a while. Downstairs, the crowd applauded faintly at something Danny must have said between tunes. Arthur closed his eyes briefly. "You know what frightens aging men most?" he asked. Freddie considered several possibilities. "Pain?" Arthur shook his head. "Irrelevance." He opened his eyes again. "One day people stop expecting you places. That's when the real disappearing begins." Freddie felt something tighten inside his chest, because he knew exactly what Arthur meant. Retirement had not frightened him financially, it frightened him socially. The slow reduction of expectation, nobody calling, nobody depending, no booth waiting, no place where absence registered meaningfully. Winter Harbour had interrupted that descent before Freddie fully acknowledged it existed. Downstairs, the crowd suddenly applauded again, louder this time. Arthur smiled faintly. "Danny's telling stories. He mistakes suffering for personality." Freddie laughed despite himself. Then the office door opened. Danny appeared holding 2 whiskeys. The patient avoiding medical supervision? Arthur accepted the drink immediately. Finally, competent treatment. Danny leaned against the doorway. The crowd's asking where you went. Arthur looked toward Freddie. You hear that? Freddie nodded. Arthur lifted the whiskey slightly. Still expected. Something in the old man's expression nearly undid Freddie completely. Not sadness, relief. They returned downstairs together. The club glowed beautifully now beneath candlelight and storm shadows. Rain streaked the high windows while the packed room hummed softly with conversation and shared weather-induced intimacy. Freddie paused halfway down the stairs. For one strange suspended moment, he saw the club almost as Leon must have seen it. Not financially, emotionally, a temporary shelter against vanishing, not curing loneliness, organizing it, giving isolated people somewhere predictable to carry themselves on difficult nights. Arthur resumed the piano. Danny raised the saxophone. The storm continued hammering the harbor outside while inside Winter Harbour Jazz Club remained stubbornly warm and illuminated against the darkness. Freddie moved behind the bar again automatically. Raina handed him glasses to polish. You look emotional, she said quietly. I do not. You absolutely do. Freddie glanced toward Arthur playing beneath candlelight. Arthur's sick. Raina nodded once. I know. Did Leon know? Yeah. Freddie dried another glass slowly. He kept booking him because he was trying to protect him. Partly. Raina watched the room carefully. But also because Arthur mattered here. The distinction settled heavily. Matter here. Outside, the storm raged across the harbor without concern for any of them. But inside, people lingered, listening, waiting, remembering one another into existence for another evening. Chapter 8. The storm knocked out power across sections of downtown overnight. By morning, Victoria looked strangely unfinished. Traffic lights failed intermittently along Douglas Street. Fallen branches blocked sidewalks near Beacon Hill Park. Cafes operated on cash only or not at all. Tourists wandered the inner harbor clutching paper maps with the mild panic of people discovering civilization depended heavily on electricity and clear signage. Winter Harbour, however, remained open. Barely. Freddie stood in the basement utility room beside an aging electrical panel while Eli held a flashlight between his teeth and muttered profanity at wiring installed sometime during the Cold War. This building, Eli announced, was apparently constructed by raccoons. Freddie studied the exposed cables nervously. Should you be touching that? No. That answer inspires very little confidence. It's honest, though. The emergency electrician couldn't arrive until late afternoon, which meant the club operated under partial power using extension cords, borrowed lamps, and one deeply concerning coffee machine arrangement Marta insisted was probably fine. Freddie had expected disaster. Instead, the situation energized everyone. Raina moved through the room with focused efficiency, organizing candles and rearranging tables closer together. Marta cooked soup on portable burners while insulting modern infrastructure. Arthur arrived early carrying sheet music in a grocery bag because the wind had destroyed his umbrella. Even Isabel looked more animated than usual. This place thrives during minor collapse, she observed while helping Freddie move liquor boxes. That should not be true. No, she agreed. But it is. By afternoon, the storm had softened into cold, drifting rain again. The harbor beyond Wharf Street looked steel gray beneath low clouds. Ferry schedules remained delayed. People moved slower through the city, tired from weather and interrupted routines. Freddie noticed something else too. Customers began calling before opening, not asking if Leon had returned, asking if the club would still be open tonight. The realization stayed with him. Not concern about business operations, concern about continuity. Winter Harbour had become part of people's emotional architecture. At 4:30, Freddie sat alone in Leon's office, reviewing another stack of notebooks. He had developed a ritual now. Coffee. Reading glasses. Silence. Then Leon's observations unfolding page by page, like messages left behind by someone attempting to document invisible weather patterns. February 11th. Victor stayed 3 hours after his wife left him. Ordered expensive whiskey like revenge against economics. March 22nd. Young couple at table 2 pretending they aren't breaking up. Both choosing songs unconsciously. April 6th. Arthur forgot the bridge twice tonight. Nobody minded. Love may simply be repeated patience. April 17th. Freddie explained depreciation schedules for 40 minutes while Jazz Trio played Coltrane behind him. Weirdly comforting. Freddie stopped reading. The mention of himself startled him every time. He barely remembered half these evenings. To Leon, apparently, they mattered. That disturbed him gently. A knock sounded against the open office door. Victor stood there holding a folded umbrella and wearing his usual expensive overcoat. "You're the accountant." Freddie sighed. "I truly need a different identity." Victor stepped inside without invitation. "Leon let me sit in here sometimes." "This is technically my office now." Victor looked around the cluttered room. "Nobody should legally own this office." "Fair point." Freddie gestured toward the chair opposite him. Victor sat carefully. Up close, the retired developer looked older than Freddie first assumed. Wealth aged people strangely. Some became softer around the edges. Others hardened into expensive versions of loneliness. Victor belonged firmly in the second category. Rain ticked softly against pipes, somewhere behind the walls. "You knew Leon well?" Freddie asked. Victor considered the question. "No," he said finally, "but consistently." Freddie nodded slowly. That felt accurate somehow. "Why do you come here so often?" Victor smiled faintly. "There's the accountant again. Always searching for underlying causes. It's how we justify invoices." Victor glanced toward the club outside the office. "My wife hated jazz. I'm sorry." "She's not dead." Victor adjusted his cuff thoughtfully. "She left." The bluntness carried no visible bitterness now. Only fatigue. 32 years married, Victor continued quietly. Then suddenly one day she informed me I had become emotionally indistinguishable from commercial real estate. Freddie winced. "That's vivid." "She wasn't entirely wrong." Victor leaned back slowly. "I spent decades building things. Condominiums, waterfront projects, hotels." He shrugged faintly. "I believed usefulness and importance were the same concept." Freddie felt that sentence physically. Outside the office, Arthur tested piano chords softly. "When she left," Victor continued, "I realized most people in my life only required my competence. Not me." Silence settled. Freddie knew that feeling intimately. Clients needed tax solutions. Employees needed decisions. Business owners needed reassurance. Competence created dependence easily. Connection was harder. "So why here?" Freddie asked quietly. Victor smiled toward the music outside. "Because nobody impressive comes to Winter Harbour anymore," he laughed softly. "That's the miracle." Freddie remembered Danny saying almost exactly the same thing. Victor stood after a moment, then paused at the doorway. Leon understood something developers never do. "What's that?" Victor looked back toward him. "People need places where they aren't performing prosperity." After he left, Freddie remained motionless in the office for several minutes. Performing prosperity. Yes. Victoria increasingly felt built around that performance now. Wellness culture, expensive restaurants, curated lifestyles, retirement seminars disguised as luxury travel advertising. People optimizing themselves publicly while quietly unraveling privately. Winter Harbour offered something else: permission to arrive unfinished. At 7, the club filled despite weather and unreliable electricity. Candles flickered across tables. Portable lamps cast soft gold light over dark wood and whiskey bottles. Customers removed wet coats while conversations folded gently into music. The room looked beautiful tonight. Not polished, human. Arthur played carefully during the first set. Freddie noticed the occasional hesitation returning, tiny moments where the old pianist appeared to search for familiar pathways through songs he had once known instinctively. Yet the audience followed him patiently, almost protectively. Nobody came to Winter Harbour demanding perfection. Halfway through the evening, Danny arrived carrying not only the saxophone case but a paper grocery bag. He dropped the bag onto the bar. "What's this?" Raina asked. "Records." "That explains nothing." Danny removed several old jazz albums carefully. Bill Evans, Chet Baker, Dexter Gordon, then one more, Miles Davis, kind of blue. The cover looked worn nearly white at the edges. "Found them in Leon's apartment," Danny said quietly. The mood shifted instantly. Raina stopped polishing glasses. Even Marta looked up from the kitchen doorway. "Police let you in?" Isabel asked from nearby. Danny shrugged. "Building manager knows me." Freddie stepped closer. "How bad was it?" Danny hesitated. "Sad." Nobody spoke for a moment, because they all understood immediately. Not violent, not chaotic, lonely. Danny rested one hand on the Miles Davis album. He left coffee cups everywhere, notes inside books, records stacked beside the couch. Danny smiled faintly. "One sock in the refrigerator somehow." "That sounds accurate," Isabel murmured. Danny nodded. He'd been listening to this. He tapped the album cover lightly. Record still sitting on the turntable. Arthur glanced over from the piano. "Of course it was." Freddie watched Isabel carefully. She looked less angry lately, still wounded perhaps, but softer around Leon's memory, as though the club itself complicated resentment by surrounding it with evidence of how deeply her father mattered to damaged people. Danny slid the Miles Davis record toward Arthur. For later. Arthur touched the cover gently. "You know," the old pianist said quietly, "Leon used to claim this album saved more middle-aged men than therapy." "That's statistically impossible," Freddie replied automatically. Arthur smiled, yet emotionally persuasive. Later that night, after the second set, Freddie found Isabel alone near the stairway entrance, staring upward toward the rain-dark street. "You okay?" She nodded vaguely. Then after a pause, "I visited his apartment this afternoon, too." Freddie waited. "It still smells like him." She laughed softly without humor. "Scotch, dust, old records, damp wool coats." Her eyes remained fixed upward. You spend years angry at someone, then suddenly all the evidence they existed becomes unbearable. Freddie stood beside her quietly. Rain moved softly down the stairwell windows. "I thought when I came here," Isabel continued, "I'd finally confirm he ruined his life with this place." "And?" She looked back toward the club, Arthur laughing weakly at something Danny whispered beside the piano. Victor sitting quietly in booth 6 beneath candlelight. Raina carrying drinks through crowded tables while remembering everyone's names and usual orders. People lingering because leaving felt emotionally abrupt. I think maybe it kept him alive instead. The sentence stayed between them gently. Freddie understood now why Leon fascinated him all those years despite every professional instinct warning otherwise. Leon had built something economically irrational but emotionally necessary. A terrible business, an essential place. Around midnight, the crowd thinned slowly. Storm fatigue settled over the city. Customers climbed the stairs reluctantly into cold, wet darkness while Arthur packed sheet music with visibly trembling hands. Danny helped him into the raincoat. "You should rest tomorrow." Arthur snorted softly. "I'm 70. Rest is increasingly implied." "I'm serious." "So am I." Freddie watched them from behind the bar. The tenderness between aging musicians surprised him repeatedly. Not sentimental, practical. Men who had spent decades disappointing themselves and one another, yet remained loyal anyway. After closing, Freddie sat alone briefly at booth 3 while Raina counted the till. The club hummed softly around him. Dishwasher running, pipes knocking faintly, rain against high windows. On stage, Danny placed Leon's old Miles Davis record onto the turntable connected to the ancient sound system. Soft trumpet filled the room. Worn, intimate, almost impossibly human. Freddie leaned back in the booth. For months after retirement, he had feared becoming unnecessary. Not poor, not sick. Invisible. Now, somehow, he sat inside a failing jazz club helping preserve a fragile ecosystem of lonely musicians, exhausted professionals, aging regulars, and emotionally stranded strangers who needed somewhere dimly lit to exist together for a few hours at a time. It was absurd, financially indefensible, possibly the most meaningful thing he had done in years. Danny lowered the music slightly. "You know what Leon used to say about this album?" Freddie looked over. Danny smiled tiredly. "He said it sounded like people trying to forgive themselves slowly." The trumpet drifted softly through the nearly empty room while rain fell steadily over Victoria Harbour. And for the first time since retirement, Freddie no longer felt like he was waiting for his life to begin again. It already had. Chapter 9. Freddie began waking before his alarm again. Not from anxiety. Purpose, the distinction mattered. At 51, he had assumed the second half of life narrowed gradually into maintenance. Health maintenance, financial maintenance, marriage maintenance for those still married. A long, slow management phase where excitement became suspicious and stability transformed into the primary adult achievement. Yet now he found himself lying awake at 6:30, thinking about jazz bookings and refrigeration repairs. It was deeply inconvenient. Rain returned overnight, soft against the condo windows, while fairy horns drifted faintly through dawn fog. Freddie shaved, dressed, and left early enough that the woman working the coffee counter near Government Street had begun preparing his order automatically. "Busy day at the club?" she asked while handing him coffee. Freddie paused. The club. Not retirement, not accounting. The club. "Probably," he admitted. Outside, downtown Victoria moved slowly through gray morning light. Delivery trucks hissed along wet streets. Seagulls wheeled above the harbor. Tourists in expensive rain jackets consulted maps with optimistic confusion. Freddie walked toward Winter Harbour carrying coffee and the uncomfortable awareness that he now belonged somewhere again. The realization both comforted and frightened him. Because belonging created vulnerability. The club smelled of bleach, coffee grounds, and wet wood when he arrived. Raina sat at the bar reviewing invoices while Eli slept upright in a booth beneath a pile of audio cables. Freddie stopped. "Is he dead?" Without looking up, Raina replied, "Probably not." Eli raised one hand weakly from beneath the cables. "Sound check emergency." "It's 10 in the morning." "Exactly." Freddie set down coffee trays. "Why are musicians nocturnal?" "Cowardice," Eli muttered. Raina accepted her coffee gratefully. "You're here early." "So are you." "I own less of my life than you do." Freddie considered this. A month ago, he would have interpreted the sentence differently. Now he understood. Responsibility occupied emotional space regardless of payroll structure. He sat beside her reviewing invoices. Winter Harbour's finances were improving, marginally. Freddie had reduced supplier costs, renegotiated payment schedules, fixed several inventory problems, and quietly eliminated catastrophic inefficiencies Leon apparently considered charming personality traits. Still, the numbers remained precarious. The club survived month to month through combinations of loyalty, improvisation, and emotional necessity difficult to quantify inside spreadsheets. Which bothered Freddie because he increasingly suspected the emotional necessity mattered most. "You know what scares me," he said suddenly. Raina glanced over. "There are several possible answers. I think this place works." She smiled faintly. "Congratulations. You discovered atmosphere." "No, I mean structurally, socially." Freddie tapped the invoices absently. "People genuinely need it." Raina stirred cream into her coffee. Yeah. That's an enormous amount of pressure for a failing basement jazz club. That's adulthood, she replied quietly. Everybody's holding together more than they admit. The sentence lingered. Freddie looked around the empty room, the dim lamps, the old piano, scuffed tables waiting for evening. Winter Harbour looked fragile in daylight, yet every night lonely people descended the stairs relieved to find it still existing, a church for emotionally exhausted civilians. At noon, Isabel arrived carrying grocery bags and a small cardboard box. "What's this?" Freddie asked. "My father's apartment," she said. The mood shifted immediately. Raina straightened behind the bar. Isabel unpacked items slowly onto the counter. Old photographs, matchbooks from jazz clubs long vanished, handwritten set lists, a brass trumpet mouthpiece worn smooth from years of use. Then finally several notebooks held together with elastic bands. Freddie stared. "Oh no." "That was my reaction too," Isabel said. Raina picked one up carefully. "He really wrote constantly. Apparently," Isabel smiled sadly, "half his apartment was paper." Freddie opened the nearest notebook cautiously. June 3rd. Freddie retired today, pretended he was excited, ordered Lagavulin like someone attending his own funeral. Freddie blinked hard. "What?" He turned the notebook toward them. Raina laughed softly. "Oh my God." Isabel leaned closer. He noticed everything. Freddie kept reading despite himself. June 17th. Victor says wealthy men become invisible because nobody asks sincere questions after success. Disturbing possibility. July 9th. Arthur forgot my birthday, but remembered every chord change in body and soul. Human brain remains absurdly selective. August 14th. Woman at table 5, reading alone every Thursday. Different book each week. Same sadness. September 2nd. Retirement terrifies men because usefulness was the only socially acceptable form of intimacy they were taught. The room went very quiet. Freddie read the sentence twice, then a third time. Nobody spoke, because all three of them understood immediately that Leon had written something true. Finally, Raina exhaled slowly. "Well," she said, "that's devastating." Freddie closed the notebook carefully. Outside, rain moved softly along Wharf Street while a ferry horn echoed through harbor fog. Useful was the only socially acceptable form of intimacy. Christ. His entire adult life suddenly rearranged itself slightly around the sentence. Clients depending on him. Employees needing guidance. Problem-solving as connection. Competence mistaken for emotional presence because men of Freddie's generation often lacked better language. Winter Harbour disrupted that pattern strangely. People came here not because anyone solved their lives, because someone noticed they arrived. The front door opened upstairs. Danny descended carrying the saxophone case and looking unusually sober. "You all look emotionally compromised." "Leon's notebooks," Isabel said. Danny stopped immediately. "Oh no." Freddie handed him one. Danny read silently for several moments, then laughed once. "What?" Danny turned the notebook around. October 12th. Danny claims sobriety improves breathing but reduces available material for saxophone solos. Scientifically questionable. Even Freddie laughed. Danny shook his head slowly. "He was impossible." "Yes," Isabel said softly. "He really was." The afternoon passed inside a strange atmosphere of shared excavation. Between routine tasks and supplier calls, they read fragments from Leon's notebooks aloud intermittently, like recovered messages from someone still speaking nearby. Marta received one. March 8th. Marta threatens produce vendors with the intensity of Cold War diplomacy. Deeply reassuring woman. Arthur received several. May 1st. Arthur plays ballads like he's negotiating privately with memory itself. Victor appeared unexpectedly around 4 and reluctantly accepted hearing his own entry. November 18th. Victor orders expensive whiskey like apology payments to himself. Victor stared into space afterward for nearly 30 seconds, then quietly said, "That's annoyingly accurate." The notebooks transformed the room, not emotionally louder, sharper. Everyone moved through the afternoon, aware Leon had been watching them carefully for years, not judging, witnessing. The distinction mattered enormously. Around 6, business began building early again. Rainy Thursdays now filled consistently. Word had spread somehow, through office conversations, divorced friend networks, exhausted provincial workers, aging musicians, and lonely retirees, that Winter Harbour remained one of the few places downtown where nobody aggressively marketed optimism. Customers arrived carrying wet coats and invisible fatigue. Freddie noticed a young couple tonight sitting silently beside the stage. Not unhappy exactly, just tired in the shared way long relationships sometimes became tired. Leon would have written about them. That realization nearly undid Freddie unexpectedly. Arthur arrived late, looking pale. Danny immediately crossed the room. "You shouldn't play tonight." Arthur removed gloves slowly. Every pianist eventually becomes hostage to younger musicians with boundary issues. "I'm serious." "So am I." Arthur sat at the piano carefully. For a moment, Freddie thought he might actually collapse. Then Arthur touched the keys, and coherence returned again. Music reorganized him. The first tune drifted softly through the crowded room, while rain darkened the high windows above. Freddie stood behind the bar, polishing glasses unnecessarily. "You're worried," Raina said quietly. "About Arthur." "Me too." Arthur played beautifully for 20 minutes. Then halfway through, in a sentimental mood, he stopped. Not dramatically. His hands simply hovered above the keys. The room waited patiently. Arthur stared downward. Danny lowered the saxophone immediately. No one moved. Finally, Arthur looked up slowly toward the audience. "I apologize," he said softly. "I appear to have temporarily misplaced Duke Ellington." Gentle laughter moved through the room. Not embarrassed laughter. Protective laughter. Arthur smiled faintly. Then Victor, from booth 6, quietly began humming the melody. Just enough. A woman near the back joined softly. Then Stan. Then several others. The room carried the tune back toward the piano. Arthur closed his eyes briefly and found the song again. Freddie felt something inside his chest break open slightly, watching it happen. Not pity, community. The tune continued gently while customers hummed along beneath rain and amber light. Danny glanced toward Freddie during the song. His expression said clearly, "Now do you understand?" Yes. Freddie understood now. Winter Harbour survived because people needed somewhere to carry one another temporarily when memory, marriage, ambition, sobriety, identity, or simple endurance began failing. A place where forgetting a melody did not disqualify you from belonging. After the set, Arthur sat alone at the bar drinking soda water with trembling hands. Freddie approached carefully. "You all right?" Arthur nodded. Then after a moment, "That was the first time I forgot where I was inside a song." Freddie sat beside him quietly. Arthur stared toward the rain-dark windows. "I used to know thousands of tunes." He smiled sadly. "Now some days I lose words halfway through breakfast." Danny appeared beside them. "You still played beautifully." Arthur looked amused. "Jazz musicians lie professionally." "No," Danny said gently. "Not about this." Arthur studied him for a long moment, then looked back toward the room. Customers still lingered beneath low light and quiet conversation while rain softened outside. "You know the strange thing?" Arthur said quietly. "I'm less frightened here." Freddie understood immediately. Winter Harbour allowed imperfection publicly. No auditions required. Arthur touched the bar lightly. Leon built a place where people could decline honestly. The sentence settled over all 3 men, heavy, true, beautiful in a devastating sort of way. Freddie looked around the club slowly. The crowded tables, the exhausted faces relaxing slightly beneath music, Raina laughing softly with regulars near the till, Isabel reviewing bookings while pretending not to watch Arthur carefully. Outside, Victoria drifted through another wet autumn night, increasingly filled with expensive loneliness. But down here beneath street level, people remained visible to one another. And Freddie suddenly realized with startling clarity that Leon had not disappeared from Winter Harbour at all. He was everywhere inside it. Chapter 10. Leon Bouchard returned on a Tuesday afternoon carrying groceries. It happened so quietly that for several seconds nobody reacted correctly. Freddie stood behind the bar, reviewing payroll reports while rain drifted softly against the high windows. Raina was arguing with a wine distributor over speakerphone using the calm, deadly tone she reserved for people attempting unjustified price increases. Marta chopped parsley in the kitchen while muttering about food costs. Arthur sat alone at the piano playing scales slowly, carefully, like a man checking whether memory still occupied the same rooms inside his mind. The front door upstairs opened. Footsteps descended the staircase. Then Leon appeared carrying 2 reusable grocery bags and looking mildly inconvenienced by weather. He stopped halfway into the room. Everyone stared. Leon looked around slowly. "Oh," he said. "You stayed open." The wine distributor continued speaking faintly through the phone. Raina hung up without a word. Arthur's hands froze above the keys. Marta emerged from the kitchen holding a knife. Freddie felt his body react before thought arrived. Relief first, then anger, then something stranger beneath both. Recognition. Leon looked thinner, not dramatically, just worn around the edges. His silver hair had grown longer. His old wool coat smelled faintly of ferry terminals and rain. He appeared exactly like a man who had spent several weeks drifting through coastal towns, avoiding his own life unsuccessfully. Nobody moved. Finally, Marta spoke. "You unbelievable bastard." Leon winced slightly. "Fair." Raina crossed the room first. Not quickly, not emotionally. She walked directly up to him and slapped him hard enough across the face that one grocery bag nearly slipped from his hand. The sound cracked through the club. Arthur nodded approvingly from the piano. "Strong wrist," he observed. Leon touched his cheek slowly. "Yes," he admitted. "Also fair." Then Raina hugged him suddenly, tightly, violently almost. Leon closed his eyes. For one brief moment, Freddie saw how exhausted the man truly was. Not theatrically exhausted, soul-tired. The kind of exhaustion that accumulated quietly over years while everyone continued needing things from you. When Raina stepped back, Isabel stood waiting. Father and daughter looked at one another across the dim afternoon club while rain whispered against the windows above. Leon's expression changed immediately. All humor disappeared. "Hi, Bug." Isabel's face tightened sharply at the old nickname. "You disappeared." "Yes." "That's all you have?" Leon lowered the grocery bags carefully onto a table. "No," he said softly. "It's just the truest part." Silence settled heavily through the room. Arthur resumed playing very quietly behind them. Something slow and uncertain. Freddie recognized it after a moment. Body and soul. Of course. Isabel folded her arms tightly. "I thought you were dead." Leon nodded once. "I know." "You let people think that." "Yes." Her eyes filled immediately then, anger finally cracking open around grief. "You selfish old man." Leon accepted this like weather. "Yes," he said again. Freddie realized suddenly that Leon had likely spent most of his adult life apologizing incompletely. Not because he lacked remorse, because he genuinely never possessed enough language for the damage he caused people who loved him. Isabel laughed shakily through tears. "You don't even defend yourself properly." "I'm very tired." The sentence changed everything, not dramatically, subtly. The room softened around him. Leon looked toward the bar, the stage, the familiar dimness of Winter Harbour glowing softly beneath afternoon lamps. I made coffee in Nanaimo for 9 days, he said quietly. Then Parksville. Then Setchelt for a bit. He shrugged faintly. Everywhere felt temporary. Freddie stared. You just wandered around Vancouver Island? Leon glanced over. Oh, good. The accountant. I ought to kill you. Also fair. Freddie moved around the bar slowly. For weeks he had imagined this moment differently. Mystery solved. Questions answered. Emotional closure arriving neatly organized. Instead, Leon stood before them damp and exhausted, carrying groceries like someone returning from an unusually depressing camping trip. What happened? Freddie asked finally. Leon looked around the club before answering. At Arthur quietly playing piano. At Marta pretending not to cry near the kitchen doorway. At Raina polishing the same glass repeatedly because standing still would apparently destroy her emotionally. At Isabel watching him with fury and relief tangled painfully together. Then Leon sighed. I got tired of being necessary. The room went silent. Completely silent. Because every person there understood immediately. Leon sat heavily at the bar. Freddie noticed his hands trembling slightly. Not alcohol tremors. Fatigue. People think loneliness comes from having nobody around, Leon said quietly. That's not true. Sometimes loneliness comes from being emotionally available to everybody all the time. Arthur stopped playing. Nobody spoke. Leon rubbed both hands slowly together. For 30 years this place needed me every single day. He laughed softly without humor. Liquor problems. Plumbing problems. Musicians falling apart at midnight. Customers wanting someone to notice they existed. He looked around the room carefully. And I loved it. That's the terrible part. Freddie felt something painful move inside his chest, because yes, that was exactly the terrible part. Leon continued staring at the bottles behind the bar. One morning I realized I couldn't remember the last day nobody needed something from me emotionally. He swallowed carefully. I started fantasizing about ferry terminals. The room remained utterly still. Outside, rain drifted through harbor fog, while downtown Victoria continued its ordinary Tuesday entirely unaware of the emotional earthquake occurring beneath street level. Isabel sat beside her father slowly. You should have called. Leon nodded. Yes. You could have told me you were drowning. Yes. Why didn't you? Leon smiled sadly. Because men like me only understand usefulness. The moment we stop functioning properly, we panic. Freddie nearly stopped breathing. The notebooks. The observations. Useful was the only socially acceptable form of intimacy they were taught. Leon had been writing about himself all along. Raina finally spoke from behind the bar. You scared everybody. Leon looked genuinely ashamed. I know. You nearly killed Arthur. Arthur snorted softly. Please. Jazz survived heroin. It'll survive Leon. But his voice shook slightly. Leon turned toward the old pianist. You still playing? Arthur smiled faintly. Badly in places. Good. Arthur's eyes narrowed gently. You look terrible. Also fair. The familiar rhythm of the room began returning gradually after that. Not normal exactly, but recognizable. Marta made soup aggressively. Raina poured Leon coffee instead of whiskey without discussion. Danny arrived midway through the afternoon, saw Leon sitting at the bar, then immediately turned around and walked back upstairs. 30 seconds later he returned carrying the saxophone case. I had to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Leon smiled tiredly. You still sober? Mostly. Excellent work. Danny stood motionless for a long moment, then quietly asked, Why didn't you call me? Leon looked down at the coffee cup. Because I knew you'd come get me. Danny laughed once, angrily. Yes, he said. I would have. Again, Leon simply nodded. No defense. No dramatic justification. Just exhausted acknowledgement of emotional damage. That honesty disarmed everyone more effectively than apologies would have. By evening, the club opened as usual. Because of course it did. Winter Harbour had survived Leon's disappearance. Now it would survive his return too. Customers arrived through soft rain carrying wet coats and ordinary sadness. News traveled quickly downstairs. By 8 o'clock, every regular knew Leon had returned, though nobody approached him dramatically. They simply nodded, smiled, relaxed visibly. Stan entered around 8:30, removed his coat carefully, then stopped upon seeing Leon seated at booth 3. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Stan said, "Knew you weren't dead." Leon smiled faintly, optimistic. Stan sat down opposite him. "You still owe me $20 from 2019. "Excellent. Structure." Nothing more needed saying. Later that night, Arthur played better than he had in weeks. Not because memory improved, because relief did. Danny joined him during the second set while candlelight flickered softly across the crowded room. Freddie stood behind the bar watching the club move around him. Conversations, music, glasses glowing amber beneath low lamps, rain against the windows, and Leon sitting quietly among the people who had spent weeks carrying his absence together. Freddie moved beside him during a break. "You know," he said, "from a legal perspective, this entire experience has been catastrophic." Leon laughed softly. "I assumed." Freddie hesitated, then asked the question waiting beneath everything. "Were you coming back?" Leon looked toward the stage where Arthur adjusted sheet music slowly beneath warm light. "I think," he said after a long pause, "I needed to know the place could survive without me." Freddie absorbed this quietly. "And?" Leon looked around the crowded club. Raina arguing affectionately with Marta. Danny helping Arthur find a chord progression. Victor sitting alone but less lonely somehow. Isabel laughing unexpectedly with customers near the bar. Freddie himself standing there with sleeves rolled up behind a whiskey counter in a failing jazz club he had accidentally inherited from retirement. Leon smiled. "Turns out," he said softly, "it was never mine in the first place." Near closing time, after the final set ended and customers drifted reluctantly back into rainy Victoria streets, Freddie remained behind the bar polishing glasses, while Leon sat nearby listening to Miles Davis through the old sound system. The club glowed softly around them. Tired, beautiful, alive. "You staying?" Freddie asked finally. Leon looked at him carefully. "Are you?" Freddie considered the question seriously, then glanced around Winter Harbour Jazz Club, at the stage, the tables, the low amber lights reflecting across whiskey bottles, the strange little underground refuge where lonely people gathered to remember one another into existence for a few hours at a time. Outside, rain moved gently through harbor fog, while ferries crossed dark water toward places filled with other tired people trying not to disappear. Freddie set down the glass slowly. "Yes," he said, and for the first time in years, the answer felt completely true.